Hello and welcome into another segment of Notes. Today we're going to be talking about the French Revolution. So let's kick things off here. Now, really, in order for us to understand this, our first section today is really focused on the causes of the French Revolution, trying to understand why this notable historical event takes place in the first place. And really, what you can break it down into is about four main kind of categories or causes of the French Revolution. And we'll talk through those today. But really, what does it look like? You have your social causes related to how society is organized in France at this time. What are those differences between those societal differences in a hierarchy? You have economic issues related to how much money do people have? What's the government spending that money on, and how are they raising it? You've got your political issues related to the questions relating to how people use their power and who has power to begin with. And then we also have our ideas that are more intellectual, our intellectual causes going back to things that we've talked about in the past with the Enlightenment. What are these new ideas that are being discussed and how are they being applied in France? So when we look at the social causes, we have a few things that we can really look at moving forward here. What's known as the old regime or the Ancien regime of France was this system of hierarchy, and it was basically divided into three different estates or social classes that basically was the way that French subjects were categorized. You had your first estate that represented the Catholic clergy. You had the second estate, which was the nobles of France. And then you had what was known as the third estate or the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the city workers, peasants, basically everybody else was part of the third estate. And each estate has very different privileges, they have different responsibilities. The way their lifestyle looks are all drastically different based on which estate you are in. As you can imagine, with these differences, we start to see a little bit of resentment as well as this unrest that starts to grow between estates, mainly because the fact that they're so different. And we can draw that difference even more when we talk about the third estate representing everybody else versus the other two estates, right? When you're talking about the nobles and the clergy. One of the other important things to note with this, okay, is that the monarch is above this. If you remember back to what we talked about with absolutism and the idea of divine right, the monarch in an absolute monarchy is more on the same playing field as a god, okay, where they can do what they want and they only answer to God versus another part of society. So again, the monarch is not part of these estates. They are completely outside and above the pyramid. So we've got these social issues. You also have economic issues. And what that really looks like is a number of things. If we go back to King Louis XIV, he ends up waging a lot of wars on other Europeans. He also spends a ridiculous amount of money on helping the Americans fight for their independence against the British. This goes back to these age-old fights between the French and the British, and the enemy of their enemy being their friend, in this case, the Americans. So we thank the French for their financial contributions to the American Revolution, but nonetheless, it really hurts their bank account and their treasury. Because of this, what we see is generations later, the taxes need to be raised in order to pay back some of these bills. They had borrowed a lot of money in order to fund these wars, and taxation needs to go up in order to pay on the principal as well as the interest on these loans. These taxes are mainly targeted at the third estate. Why? Well, the third estate represents about 97% of the population. So that's where this targeted taxation plan goes into place. Mind you, though, the third estate is the poorest, the middle class, and the peasant class of French society. So they're not the ones with a ton of money, but they're the ones that are going to be targeted. This is all going on at a time where France is also experiencing different kind of macroeconomic events. We're seeing that Overall, that there is a cost of living crisis in France at this time, where basic necessities for the people of France are going up to the point where real wages aren't keeping up with prices, which causes a lot of issues. This is all kind of uh, magnified by the fact that uh, France at this time has some series of bad harvests. And what this does is it basically means that there's a lack of grain, which means then that there's a lack of bread, or the bread prices go up because there's a limited supply and the demand is still high. Causes bread prices to double. Okay? And basically, that means that we start having famine and starvation throughout France because bread was kind of the main staple of a third estate uh, French person's diet at this time. We can also look at the political causes of this and what this really looks like in the late 1700s is basically that you have a French monarch who's essentially asleep at the wheel. Pretty weak and uninterested in running the country, that the affairs of the state aren't necessarily what King Louis XVI wants to spend a ton of time on. He's the great great grandson of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, the one that we talk about as kind of like that model for absolutism. But King Louis XVI is different. He becomes king at a pretty young age. Right? He is coronated at the age of 20, which means that he's still really young in this process. He's shy, he's awkward. A lot of historical uh, sources talk about the fact that he was pretty hesitant when it came to decision making. And he liked spending more of his time on his own hobbies and interest outside of governing. And basically, because of this, he ignores the nation's debt, ignores a lot of the problems, and ignores his political advisors during this time. You also have this coupled with his wife, Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette comes from the Austrian royal family. She's the daughter of Maria Theresa and ends up marrying Louis basically to create an alliance between Austria and France to try to keep things relatively peaceful in France at this time. She doesn't really fit into French society, though, is kind of out of place with the French court, dislikes the French people, and a lot of people start seeing Marie Antoinette as a symbol of interference with the government. She's giving Louis bad advice. She's not doing what is needed. And the other big problem was is that they were not producing an heir, that there was no male uh, child being produced by Louis and Marie Antoinette, which meant really bad things for the line of royal succession. She also spent a ton of money. That was another big problem, that these large sums of money were going to gowns and jewelries and parties to the point where she becomes known basically as Madame Deficit, that she is spending so much money at a time where France really doesn't have a lot of money to spend. We also have to talk about the intellectual climate of this time. During the past several decades, we've been seeing these ideas start to kind of make their way into the mind of the mainstream. The Enlightenment, this idea or series of ideas about how society should be governed, is really kind of in the mainstream. The United States takes it full force, demonstrates how absolute monarchy or even constitutional monarchy isn't necessary, and that they can come up with their own society that values liberty and equality moving forward. You have French philosophers at this time, like Voltaire and Rousseau, that are talking about these ideas too, about liberty and equality and democracy, and they're starting to catch on with educated commoners. This will lead us into what we'll talk about next with this kind of moderate stage of the French Revolution. But I thank you for listening and hope that you join us for part 2.